for our country. But nevertheless, the president will continue to unify this nation through policies that are grounded in common sense and that uplift all Americans. We have an individual in our new media seat today, Mary Margaret Olohan, who is the Daily Wire's first ever White House correspondent. Congratulations, Mary Margaret. The Daily Wire was founded 10 years ago by Ben Shapiro. The Daily Wire now has over 1 million paid subscribers, a monthly network reach of 138 million, and has evolved into a leading conservative multimedia giant. They are now the 5th largest podcast network in the world and home to some of the top-ranked shows. With that, I will take your questions, and Mary Margaret, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's great to be here. You talked about behavior from Democrat lawmakers, a lot of disruptions, and I just wanted to kind of go back to that. We saw Democrat lawmakers not stand for Laken Riley, for Peyton McNabb, for the son of a slain police officer and 13-year-old cancer survivor. What are the optics of that nationally, just in terms of not just the people who were in the room last night, but across the nation? And also, was President Trump expecting this type of behavior when he was crafting his speech?
So I gave a quote to one of the media outlets in this room yesterday that Democrats behaving like children would be the least surprising thing of the night. And unfortunately, that quote did turn out to be true. I think the president and everyone, frankly, was surprised by the Democrats refusing to stand for not the president's policies, because frankly, we expected that, but for the everyday Americans who President Trump was shining a light on their stories. Mark Fogel, for instance, an American school teacher who was detained by the Russians. President Trump freed him. If Joe Biden had done that, they all would have been on their feet, but because of it came from President Trump, they weren't. So we think it's very sad, but we're very proud of the president today, and the American people are the people that this president cares about most, and the reviews are in, and everybody loved his speech.
Thank you. And then on Maine, we know that the governor of Maine has really pushed back against the president's executive order saying that boys should not be in girls' sports. I spoke with a lawmaker from Maine this morning who told me she'd been censured by state lawmakers for calling a man and speaking up on this. What is the next move for the White House in this battle to protect the integrity of women's sports?
Yeah, well, the Department of Education has sued the state of Maine. As you know, there's ongoing litigation. The president has made a commitment to ensure that states are being held accountable if they continue to allow men in women's sports, which he believes is an egregious violation of taxpayer dollars. And so that fight continues, and the president won't back down. Again, this is a common sense policy. 80% of the American people, including more than 60% of Democrats, do not want men in women's sports. So the president will stand by this commitment. Thank you. Gabe.
3 automakers today speaking about potentially delaying tariffs.
I can confirm, and I'm glad that you asked, because the president sent me out here with a statement directly from him on this. I saw it was reported earlier today by Bloomberg News, and he wanted me to share this with all of you. We spoke with the big 3 auto dealers. We are going to give a 1-month exemption on any autos coming through USMCA. Reciprocal tariffs will still go into effect on April 2nd, but at the request of the companies associated with USMCA, the president is giving them an exemption for 1 month so they are not at an economic disadvantage. So the 3 companies that he spoke to are Stellantis, Ford, and General Motors. They requested the call, they made the ask, and the president is happy to do it. It's a 1-month exemption.
And the president just posted on social media that he had spoken with Prime Minister Trudeau. He says he's not satisfied with what the Prime Minister has said when it comes to fentanyl, but less than 1%, as you know, less than 1% of the fentanyl seized last year was in the northern border. What else does Canada need to do?
Well, the president did just put out a statement on his call with the governor, Justin Trudeau, as he calls him, of Canada, and he said that he was not pleased, as you said. He said it's not good enough. He told Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that directly. The call ended in a somewhat friendly manner, as the president said, but he's not going to stop standing up for the American people. And to answer your question directly when it comes to fentanyl, for the last 4 years, unfortunately, our neighbors to the north and the south, Canada and Mexico, respectively, have allowed America to be a dumping ground, not just for illegal aliens, but for illegal, poisonous, deadly fentanyl, which is now the #1 killer of young people in this country aged 18 to 34. Through the northern border in Canada, in last fiscal year alone, there was enough fentanyl seized to kill 4.8 billion people. And that number is up 2,050% from 2023, the year before. So there's been more than a 2,000% increase in illegal fentanyl seizure at the northern border. Why? Because Canada is allowing that fentanyl to come to the United States. The president sees these numbers, he thinks about the lives that are lost, and everybody in this room, I'm sure, everybody watching at home, everybody across the country knows someone in our lives who has been killed at the hands of this deadly poison. There needs to be repercussions for that. The president feels very strongly about it.
But Caroline, respectfully, it's just 43 pounds that were found last year. That's less than a carry-on suitcase. Is that a lot of fentanyl compared to, say, Mexico, where the vast majority of the fentanyl is brought in through Mexico, not Canada? So what else does Canada need to do?
Well, I just told you, last year alone, there was a 2,000% increase in illegal fentanyl.
But it's only 43
You're asking
pounds,
me,
Carol.
you're asking me for what the president's justification is for these tariffs. It's not up to you. You're not the president, Gabe. And frankly, I think it's a little bit disrespectful to the families in this country who have lost loved ones at the hands of this deadly poison. If you talk to them, and this president has, they are grateful that they finally have a president who is standing up to both Canada and Mexico, and most importantly, to China as well. The president added an additional 10% tariff on China because this deadly poison is being produced in that country. It's being distributed through our neighbors, and there needs to be consequences for that, period. Peter.
Thank you, Caroline. If the U.S. has a longstanding policy that we do not negotiate with terrorists, then why is the U.S. now negotiating directly and for the first time ever with Hamas?
Well, when it comes to the negotiations that you're referring to, first of all, is engaged in those negotiations does have the authority to talk to anyone. Israel was consulted on this matter. And look, dialogue and talking to people around the world to do what's in the best interest of the American people is something that the president has proven is what he believes is good faith effort to do what's right for the American people.
Is it just about the hostages, or are they also talking about the president's plan to take over Gaza?
These are ongoing talks and discussions. I am not going to detail them here. There are American lives at stake. I would defer you to the Department of State for further details, but I'm not going to get into those talks here at this podium.
We know that some officials here were miffed that Zelensky showed up last week without a suit for his meeting in the Oval Office, but Elon Musk never wears a suit.
He did last night.
So what is the dress code?
Well, Elon Musk wore a suit last night. I'm sure you saw it.
Was he spooked by the Zelensky, Zelensky getting kicked out?
No, I don't think so. I'm just pointing out that he did wear a suit last night, and I think the president liked that very much, and he looked great. Speaking of the president, he just passed me a note while I'm standing here. He wanted me to hold this up. This is the poll that I cited, the CBS YouGov poll that shows that 76% of those who watched the president's speech last night approved of his speech. And so it goes to my earlier point that I made in my monologue about how incredibly sad it is that we have a modern-day Democrat Party who is so severely out of touch with the American public. This is a great poll. The ultimate poll, though, came on November 5th when the president won by an overwhelming margin that he spoke about last night. Democrats weren't. Ouija.
Thank you, Caroline. Back on tariffs, last night President Trump said there will be a little disturbance, but we're okay with that. Can you put a dollar figure amount on how much the average American family should expect to pay as this disturbance? And why should Americans be okay with that when so many are already struggling to pay the bills?
Well, first of all, last night, the president told the truth. And he was realistic, and he level set with the American people. And I think, frankly, it's very refreshing, and everybody in this room should be very grateful that we have a president who tells the truth about the reality of the economic situation that we are in, unlike the previous president who lied to everybody's faces, saying inflation was transitory, saying it was under control, saying that the border was secure, when none of that was true. So the president is being frank and honest, and the American people elected this president to have monumental reform and change, including rebuilding our manufacturing base in this country, standing up to foreign nations who have been ripping off our country for decades. And that requires a little bit of disruption. That requires a lot of effort and work that this president is focused on doing. With that said, as the president said last night, his administration is wholeheartedly committed, of course, to ending the inflation nightmare caused by the Biden administration. Look at the deregulation efforts. Look at the president's push last night in his speech for Congress to pass tax cuts, to end taxes on Social Security and overtime pay for hardworking Americans, end taxes on tips. We need Congress to get that done because that's going to put more money back into the pockets of the American people. And I didn't even mention energy. Look at the president's approach and focus on unleashing the might of our energy industry. We know that's the #1 driver of inflation. He's been slashing back a lot of the burdensome regulation from the previous administration to unleash our energy industry here at home, which will drive down costs. He said he is committed to making America affordable again. He did it in his first term, and Americans can trust him to do it again.
President Trump
Sure.
has made clear, Caroline, that he loves tariffs, but the stock market does not. How does he factor that into his decision-making?
Well, the president does love tariffs. He said it's one of his favorite words in the English dictionary, and he believes in tariffs because they'll ultimately make America rich again. They're going to raise revenue. They're going to help us pay down our debt. Most importantly, they're going to bring American jobs here back home. So I think for folks on Wall Street who may be concerned, look at what this president did for you in his first term. Wall Street boomed. Stock market boomed. The president expects that to happen again, but most importantly, Main Street is going to boom, and that's why the president has this whole of government economic approach, which includes tax cuts, tariffs, regulation cuts, and an energy industry that will bring down costs for American consumers. Sure, Monica.
Thank you, Caroline. You mentioned not one Democrat senator voted to protect women's sports from males. Not one Democrat congressman or congresswoman stood to applaud or support protecting women's spaces and sports at the president's joint session to Congress last night, as you articulately mentioned at the beginning. So I'm wondering, what message is that sending to not only young women who are competing in these sports across the country, but also to the parents of these young girls?
Yeah. I think the message that Americans should take away from last night is that they have a president in the Oval Office who is committed to doing what's right for them, especially women and girls across the country. And I think it's very ironic, thank you for bringing up the point about women, that Democrat women were wearing pink to support our fellow females, yet they couldn't stand, again, for a young woman who was almost killed and severely injured by a man on the volleyball court. They couldn't stand for the mothers of two beautiful young women whose lives were taken tragically at the hands of illegal people. So you can't say you're the party of women and then support men and women's sports and not stand up for basic law and order and immigration reform that will protect women in this country. That's what President Trump is doing. He's the president for women. Lindsay, good to see you.
Thank you, Caroline. Good to see you. So, speaking of tariffs, China said yesterday that they're ready for any kind of war with the U.S. Because of these tariffs that have been placed on them. And a Chinese spokesperson also said that the tariffs would not lead to a resolution of U.S. concerns about fentanyl originating in China. Can you speak to how the administration is planning on responding to that?
Well, I think Secretary Hegseth has responded to that this morning. He said that America will always be prepared to defend itself, especially under the leadership of this president in the Oval Office, and that certainly remains true. Again, when it comes to tariffs, the president has been very tough on China, not just now with 20% and more with the reciprocal tariffs that will hit on April 2nd, but look at what he did in his first term. There were billions of dollars worth of tariffs that he implemented on China, and it's quite telling that the previous administration did not rescind those tariffs because they realized the value that they had in not only deterring China, but also raising revenue here in the United States. Rachel.
Thanks, Caroline. Just a quick follow-up, two quick follow-ups on tariffs. The president mentioned a little disturbance during his remarks yesterday. The CEO of Target says that consumers will likely see prices go up on everything from strawberries to bananas to avocados. How long should Americans expect to pay higher prices? Are we talking a week, a couple of days, a few months?
Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I can assure the American people is that this president and this administration is doing everything they can. And I would remind you and everybody else in this room that it's because of the previous administration's economic policies that Americans were left with record high inflation. Inflation throughout Joe Biden's entire 48 months in office was at or above 3%. It hit record highs, as you know. And there's a whole list of what the Biden economic disaster this president was left to clean up. It's been a month, but he's working hard every single day to do just that.
One quick follow-up on the carve-out. Sorry to cut you off there. the U.S. imported $43 million worth of eggs from Canada. I know you mentioned some of the exemptions when it comes to automakers. Will there be any other carve-outs, including for eggs? We know prices are soaring for Americans.
The president is open to hearing about additional exemptions. He always has open dialogue, and he'll always do, what's right, what he believes is right for the American people. But again, as for the egg crisis in this country, the president is wholeheartedly committed to ensuring we're increasing our egg supply, and we're also bringing down cost. And Secretary Rollins has been all over this issue. She comes from an agricultural background and family. That's why she's leading that very important department. She wrote an amazing op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. She's been all over the media talking about her plan. She has a real plan. The president endorses it. And he even, gave her an off-the-prompter shout-out last night to say, Brooke, I'm counting on you. It's an important issue. And this White House is working with Secretary of Agriculture every single day to address this issue. Sure. Jordan.
Thanks, Caroline. So, what does it say that the Democrats, while they couldn't stand for Americans or stand for victims, they stood for war and clapped for war and clapped for 5 more years of war?
Yeah, the president addressed that last night, I think, when he called out Senator Elizabeth Warren and said that, again, as I said in my opening speech, very telling that the Democrats refused to clap for American people and American interests and American priorities, but they did clap for the country of Ukraine, which, by the way, the president's working very hard to end that war. So Democrats should be applauding him for actually doing something about it.
Follow up on that if I
Sure.
can. You've spoken recently about how what happened in the Oval Office last week gave Americans an inside look into behind-the-scenes discussions with Zelensky. Is this how he treated Joe Biden and just treated him disrespectfully and received billions of dollars?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I don't know if anybody in here asked my predecessor who stood at this podium about that, but there was a report from NBC News that President Biden also got increasingly frustrated with President Zelensky when he was handing out blank checks and President Zelensky kept asking for more. Joe Biden was quite frustrated with that. So again, as I've said repeatedly, Friday revealed the frustrations that this administration has had in closed-door negotiations with the Ukrainians. However, President Zelensky did put out a statement yesterday, which we believe is a positive step forward. And National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has been talking to his Ukrainian counterparts. And so we're in the midst of this, and we'll see what happens next. Caitlin.
Thanks, Caroline. I have 2 questions. One on the reprieve that is being granted to these 3 automakers for 1 month on the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. How did the president settle on 1 month?
The reciprocal tariffs will go into effect on April 2nd, and he feels strongly about that no matter what, no exemption, so that's where the 1 month comes from.
Does he expect them to be able to shift production within a month?
He told them that they should get on it, start investing, start moving, shift production here to the United States of America, where they will pay no tariff. That's the ultimate goal.
And on the conversations between the White House and the Ukrainians and the letter that President Trump revealed last night that he got from President Zelensky, Director Ratcliffe said today that the president has paused also intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Is that temporary or is that permanent?
I believe what the National Security Council told me in regards to that was that they paused or they are reconsidering the funding for Ukraine, as you saw, the pause on the funding. As for intelligence matters, I would refer you to either the National Security Council or the CIA as well.
But they're considering lifting or reinstating the military aid going to Ukraine, which they paused.
Again, it's a pause for a review.
Follow up on that.
Sure.
The president read parts of the letter that he received last night from President Zelensky. Can you give us a sense of when President Trump now plans to sign that minerals deal after receiving that letter?
Those talks are happening as we speak. I just saw the National Security Advisor. He's working very hard on it. I believe he was going into the Oval Office to give the president an update on where this stands. But again, the president is committed to a peace deal. He wants to see this war end. And I think that President Zelensky's message, which he also shared on X as well, is a positive sign in the right direction.
The president also said that the United States was reclaiming the Panama Canal. The president of Panama this morning, or at some point today, said that President Trump was lying. Wanted to get your response to that, and also curious if the president had a reason for not specifically mentioning BlackRock last night when he was praising the company that is buying canals or ports around the Panama.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Panama has seen what's going on with their own canal, but as you just mentioned, BlackRock is now interested in investing and taking over the two ends of the port, which is very important because the president was very vocal several weeks ago about the need to ensure that China is not controlling the Panama Canal. This is a very important place for the United States of America. We also saw that the Panama Canal lifted fees on our U.S. naval ships that are going in and out of the canal. That's a win for the United States of America, and the president will continue to ensure that the Chinese government, the CCP, cannot be infiltrated in the Western Hemisphere, and certainly not in the Panama Canal, which is a very important place for our country. Dasha.
The president continues to call the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, Governor of Canada. I'm curious what he means by that, and if there are any plans that are moving forward with trying to make Canada the 51st state. And I have a follow-up on the economy as well.
Sure. Well, the president put that in his True Social account, or his True Social post earlier today. He feels strongly that it would be very beneficial for the Canadian people to be the 51st state of the United States. They wouldn't be paying for these tariffs. They'd have much lower taxes if they were part of our great country.
On the economy, you and I traveled the country during the campaign. This is an issue that so many voters decided to cast their ballots on, and they voted for President Trump. He has started to have that realistic conversation with the American people, that disturbance comment last night. But I'm curious if you can be real with Americans right now as all of these factors are playing out. Are things potentially going to get worse before they get better?
Look, I've now been asked and answered this same question just given to me in different verbiage of 3 different times, and I will answer it again in an effort of transparency to the American people, because this is an important issue, and the American people, this president understands that it is. And again, that's why in his joint address to Congress last night, he addressed this issue with a realistic and honest approach. He talked about what this administration is doing to unleash American energy and to make America affordable again, and this administration is wholeheartedly committed to doing it. And I would remind the American public that the first-term record of this president speaks volumes. That's why they reelected him, because they know that he can fix our broken economy, and it's very, very broken from the previous administration. Stephen.
Thank you, Caroline. I've got 2 questions, one on press access, the other on fentanyl and tariffs.
Sure.
On press access, your predecessor, Karine Jean-Pierre, who presided over many novel press access restrictions, criticized the recent changes to the press pool made by your office. She said in an interview, quote, "What we're looking at is what North Korea is doing." What's your response to that, and can you say anything to allay concerns that unfavorable coverage will be punished in this new press pool system?
I think that's the same individual who said from this podium numerous times that the commander-in-chief was mentally and physically up for the job, which we knew was a lie. Many people in this room knew it was a lie. Many of you were admonished for asking questions about that truth. So when it comes to truth and transparency, this administration, this White House is setting the example. This president is taking far more questions than his predecessor, Joe Biden, did on a daily basis, and that will continue.
And on fentanyl and tariffs, fentanyl produced largely in China has killed 334,000 Americans over 5 years. According to CDC data, that's about 1 in every 1,000 Americans. President Trump has cited this for applying new tariffs to Canada, Mexico, and China. But in addition to China's talk about being ready for any kind of war, they said yesterday, the foreign ministry said that, quote, "The fentanyl issue is a flimsy excuse to raise U.S. tariffs," and, quote, "The U.S., not anyone else, is responsible for the fentanyl crisis." So what's the response to China that the talk of fentanyl is just an excuse for tariffs, and what does that say about the resolution?
Well, of course, the country that is getting very rich off of distributing this deadly poison to American citizens is going to say that. Again, the president knows where the American people stand on this issue. Fentanyl overdoses. Dasha brought up all of us campaigning all across the country. They talked about inflation. They also talked about the border, the illegal immigrants that we're pouring through, but also these deadly drugs. And again, the president keeps in mind those families every single day when he is making these tough decisions. But it's a necessary decision, and he's no longer going to allow the United States of America to be a dumping ground for illegal immigrants and for illegal drugs that are killing our nation's people. This is the #1 leading cause of death in our country, and there needs to be action taken to ensure that that cannot continue. Thank you very much, guys. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Caroline.
All right, we have been listening to the weekly press briefing by Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt this afternoon. Another wide-ranging give and take Q&A with members of the White House press pool, including our political director, Lindsay Keith, who you heard from, and we will hear from her as she walks out and gets in front of the camera. Several things to note from this one. The big takeaway, in my opinion, is that the big three auto dealers, we're talking about Ford, we're talking about General Motors, and we're talking about Stellantis. Stellantis owns the car brands Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Maserati, in case you're wondering. They're commonly referred to as the big three when it comes to the auto dealers. They are now getting a 1-month exemption from the tariffs, okay? And when pressed on why 1 month, Caroline Leavitt explained that will come April 2nd is when the reciprocal tariffs take effect. Basically, whatever other countries are charging the United States on its imports, on what's going out of our country and into theirs, is what they will now be paying here at home for their imports into our country. So that's an interesting note there. Several things that Caroline Leavitt pointed out was, obviously this is on the heels of the big speech last night to Congress in which the president, according to CBS, a YouGov poll, 76% of Americans approved of his message last night, while 23% disapprove. Caroline Leavitt went on to say that Mr. Trump has never been more popular, that according to a survey done by the Daily Mail. But it got really interesting when she was asked about the Democratic response inside the chamber when President Trump was speaking. You remember what happened. We watched as Texas Congressman Al Green was escorted out. But then Caroline Leavitt doubled down, and she said that the Democrat Party has become a party of insanity and hate. And here's what else she said. Listen to this.
The behavior of Democrats last night was completely disgraceful and demonstrated how severely out of touch they are with the American public. It was the most shameful moment in the history of presidential addresses in that beautiful chamber. In what was supposed to be a unifying moment for our country, Democrat members of Congress instead screamed at the President of the United States, who was just overwhelmingly reelected by their constituents, walked out of the chamber, and worst of all, they disrespected the American people. Democrats didn't stand to keep men out of women's sports. They couldn't even clap for a girl who got her head smashed in by a man on a volleyball court. Democrats didn't stand for an innocent and beautiful child who is surviving brain cancer. They opposed eliminating taxes on tips and Social Security. They didn't stand in favor of cutting taxes for hardworking Americans. They couldn't even clap for 2 mothers whose daughters were killed by illegal aliens. One of the only things that could get Democrats off their feet last night was cheering for Ukraine, not for America. Last night was a very clarifying moment for our country. The Democrats exposed themselves as the party of insanity and hate, the party that wants to put America last.
You know, she went on to say that this Trump derangement syndrome is keeping people from doing their jobs that they were elected to do. One thing to point out, and again, we're getting close to hearing from our political director, Lindsay Keith, will have great context on both sides of the story. But a recent poll, in fact, it came out in January, when it comes to biological men and women's sports, 78%, take a look at the poll right here, 78% of parents oppose biological males who identify as females being allowed to participate in girls' sports teams. All right, and then when you break down that number, 86% of Republicans say, we don't want men playing in women's sports. 80% of independents say, we don't want men in women's sports. And look at 60% of Democrats say the same thing. But when it came up for a vote on Monday night, every single Democrat in the Senate voted against it. Let's bring our political director, Lindsay Keith, now. Lindsay, we're trying to make sense of this disconnect, and I thank you for braving the weather. I know it's a rainy day there in our nation's capital. Let's just rewind. talk to us about your big takeaway from the press briefing, and of course we heard your question as well.
Yeah, obviously an important press briefing after the president's first joint address to Congress last night. And you saw that flash polling by CBS that Caroline put up, and the president asked to be brought out for everyone to see. He had actually posted on Truth Social saying that 76% of viewers approved and liked his speech last night. Again, that's flash polling. About 51% of those respondents were Republicans, 27% independents, and 20% Democrats, kind of showing you a range of who was tuning in last night to hear the president there. But again, you know, overwhelmingly, we've seen a lot of polls. His average approval rating right now is sitting around 48, 49%, which is much higher than his first presidency. You know, but you're hearing even from many Democrats this morning who are saying, listen, this is our opportunity to figure out how we're going to respond to this administration. This is coming fresh off an election just in November when Democrats were handed a decisive win. And President Trump being the first Republican in decades to win the popular vote. And so clearly he's feeling emboldened in many ways. And you hearing that from Caroline Levitt as well. But I think the big conversation this morning really is about tariffs, as that is something that the American people are concerned about, how that may impact their pocketbooks. And the economy, as you know, is something that President Trump won on decisively. It was something that President Biden was not able to meet the moment on, find the right messaging. People were very frustrated with him. And so there's a lot of question around how this will impact. And he said, be patient last night, but a lot of questions in the press briefing were, how patient should the American people be, and how long do they have to wait to see these long-term gains? How much short-term pain will there be?
Yeah, and they admit, right, that there will be some give and take here. The question, obviously, Lindsay, as you point out, is for how long. The big three automakers and the deal with tariffs seems to be a huge headline out of this briefing today as well.
Yes. Absolutely. That was breaking news out of the presser there. An announcement from the president saying that he had just had a meeting this morning with the three major automakers in Michigan. And again, this had been one of the big concerns yesterday that Alyssa Slotkin brought up, Senator from Michigan there. As we know, so much of the car industry between Michigan and Canada goes back and forth, how our cars are made. And so there was a lot of frustration from some of these car manufacturers saying this is nearly impossible for us to actually manufacture these cars because we're going in the assembly process, going back and forth so much. And if we're slapping a 25% tariff on every way, there's no way these cars will be affordable for anybody. And so the president giving a 30-day pause there. You know, I thought it was fascinating because Caroline was asked why it was only 30 days that was given to that pause. And she said because the president wants all reciprocal tariffs to be in place April 2nd. And you heard him, Chris, last night in his speech really talking that date is so important to him of April 2nd. He said he wanted it to be April 1st, but that's obviously April Fool's, and he didn't want it to look like a joke. But that April 2nd date to him is critical. I'm not sure what the intel is on that, Howard Lutnick or who is advising him that April 2nd date is such a critical date. So we'll have to look into that a little bit more. But again, this pause for 30 days is very positive for the automaking industry right now. Big
like
win for them this morning.
Big news out of that press briefing in terms of actual news. I think that was a big headline to come out. You mentioned it, and I think you're right. A lot of people are worried about what these tariffs could mean here at home, right? And so we now have the CEOs of companies across the country now speaking out. In fact, the CEO of Chipotle, for example, take a look at this. This is Scott Boatwright. He says, it is our intent as we sit here today to absorb those costs, right? And then you have another CEO, this one, the CEO of Target, says, when talking about the fruits and the veggies, many of which they get from Mexico, they say those are categories where we'll try to protect pricing, but the consumer will likely see price increases over the next couple of days. Right? And then there's one more from Best Buy. She was on, the CEO was on an earnings call saying that, potentially this price will be passed on to the consumer, making price increases for American consumers highly likely. So Lindsay, that, again, when you're talking about, the Trump administration highlights the fact that they inherited what they say is this inflation crisis. And I want your opinion. Is that fair? Is that not fair? But the bottom line is Trump was elected in part to fix things, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chris. So it's twofold, and that's why this is a challenging conversation to obviously talk about. But at the end of the day, you know, when you become president, you do inherit whatever the past administration hands you, and you only really have a certain amount of time, a small window to blame shift, which we heard from the president last night, really pointing blame on inflation, the price of eggs, on the previous administration, before you say, okay, this is on my watch now, and we have to figure out how to fix it. Can't talk about the past anymore. We got to talk about the future. That's what the American people want at the end of the day. They don't want to hear about whose fault it is. They just want to know how you're going to fix it so that they are not having to pay these inflated prices for everyday goods. And that is what some Republicans were critical of the president last night, saying that he could have spoken more clearly on that, drawn out the plan that administration has. And you heard here in the press briefing earlier, Caroline Leavitt talking about what the Agriculture Department is trying to do to focus on bird flu, which is one of the reasons the prices of eggs have gone up, and addressing that. And some people question, why didn't the president go into more detail on some of that stuff if the administration does have a plan? But I really think this is what it comes back to, Chris, at the end of the day. You look at what happened during the election cycle, and as I mentioned before, Joe Biden was not able to say to the American people, wow, I really can tell that you are still reeling from inflation. Because inflation had gone down from 9% to almost 2% on his watch, at 3%, you know, he thought that that was a huge gain, and he wanted the American people to see that and to recognize that, instead of saying, no, I still empathize with you. And he was unable to meet the moment. It's something that President Trump was able to do on the campaign trail. And so that's what Republicans are hoping that he will continue to do. Obviously, be honest with American people, but also empathize and sympathize. And this is one of the key issues. Last point I'll make here, there was a CBS poll that was taken just the end of last month, and it said that 86% of the American, or sorry, rather 76% of American people were saying, you know, the economy is my top issue right now, but only 36% of people said that they thought that the president was focusing on it enough. So that's a huge disparity there that Republicans would like to see the president shore up.
Yeah, no, great point. You know, for the life of me, I'm trying to figure out the disconnect. And what I mean by that is you hear about what people say in the polling when it comes to, you know, biological men and women's sports, right? You had a great interview, by the way, this morning. We'll have more of that tonight on the News on Merit TV. So there's a disconnect there, right? When you have all 45 Democrats vote no to a bill that would keep biological men out of women's sports, but then polling shows that 60% of Democrats who were polled say, yeah, we don't want men in our girls' sports. So there's that disconnect. And then, you know, my question really, Lindsay, is you saw last night, you were in Emancipation Hall. You were surrounded by lawmakers, many of whom agree with what the president's doing and many of whom disagree, right? It's split right down the middle. But when you have people who are holding signs and, you know, refusing to stand up, when talking about a 13-year-old boy who's battling brain cancer, and gets an honorary badge from the Secret Service, is that not something that you can stand up for? And the message that it sends, because if you can't stand up because you don't like the president's policies, man, I think everyone gets it. But when you're talking about, you know, Laken Riley and her sister and her mom are there, and they're honoring them. And that was a bipartisan bill, by the way, that passed the House and the Senate. Both Republicans and Democrats supported that. And you can't stand up and clap for that family. Then how can the American people think you're going to stand up, go across the aisle, and work on an issue that's important to their families? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a great point. Absolutely. And that's a lot of the conversation that's happening around the country this morning, is that disconnect, even from many Democrats saying that because you have this, you know, orange man bad, Trump derangement syndrome, whatever you want to call it, that it inhibited Democrats from being able to support some of these humanized moments of everyday Americans who are struggling on many issues that the president obviously won on, and bipartisan issues at that, as you mentioned, just like the Laken Riley Act, Act, which had overwhelming bipartisan support. Yet you didn't see people stand for that, which was very fascinating moment there. Even a tax on tips, something that Kamala Harris ran on when the president spoke about that. No Democrat stood or applauded that. So these are kind of the moments where it felt like you are not responding specifically because of the person delivering the message, but if you were listening to what the American people wanted, you may have a much different response. And that is the disconnect right now, because President Trump is one of the most polarizing politicians that we've seen in modern time. And because of that, oftentimes you have these people across the aisle who are unwilling to even show a hint of daylight that they may be in alignment with him in any way. So we'll see how this pans out, because you talk about that bill that didn't pass in the Senate that would prohibit trans athletes in women's sports. You only needed 7 Democrats to come across the aisle. And as I talked to Peyton McNabb earlier, she gave a very strong message that we'll play tonight to the Democratic Party on what she feels like they need to hear. But, you look at what happened at the end of the election cycle. President Trump spoke very boldly on this issue, and really many, even Republicans, were concerned that this may derail him from the presidency. He put out some very strong campaign ads specifically on this issue of trans athletes in women's sports. And yet it was actually something that got a ton of bipartisan support. Many moms, parents coming across the aisle saying, actually, this is the issue that was key for me. And so, it's one of those things that is not vogue to talk about, yet this is what people are having conversations about at their kitchen tables. And it's one of the things that Democrats right now have not quite figured what their collective response is to this administration, as they are seeking to win back at least majority in the House in the midterms. But you even had someone like House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries saying we should not be the story this morning. And that's exactly actually what has happened.
Yeah, I think for the American people, it's both disappointing and frustrating, right? As you're sitting there and you're listening to something that you think shouldn't be a partisan issue, but it has become a partisan issue because of the person delivering the speech. Lindsay, great context as always. And in case you're wondering, I think Dr. Phil wrapped it up beautifully last night. And we'll hear from that because he addresses this issue. And you'll hear some of that commentary from Dr. Phil, because you've probably missed it. It was 11:30 Central, 12:30 out east when he was wrapping up his town hall. But it was again something that only Dr. Phil can say it, and the way that he says it, right? That I think people at home will really appreciate, because he does care about the culture in America and how things that come out of the Oval Office, how it impacts American families, and he's got a real heart for that, and I think you'll appreciate what you hear from him later on tonight. So Lindsay, thank you as always. We will see you and our viewers tonight for the news on Merit TV at 7 Eastern. 7 Eastern? Yeah, 7 Eastern, 6 Central, right here on Merit TV. I'm Chris Gutierrez. We'll see you a little bit later this afternoon.
05, and you can also get up to $15,000 in free gold and silver with a qualified purchase. Or simply call